Hi, Stephen E. Andrews, outlaw bookseller here, experienced for many years, decades and decades, in selling fantasy fiction and SF. I really like SF, but I've always sold loads of fantasy as well. I started selling books back in '84, in the week, I think, that The Colour of Magic by Terry Pratchett was published. So the boom had been going then for about 7 years, and we'd had Terry Brooks, we'd had Stephen Donaldson, we'd had David Eddings, who was huge then Pratchett. Soon after that, we'd have Raymond Feast. But none of this stuff really did it for me. And if you want to know why, you can watch my video about the Artificial Fantasy trilogy since 1977. So just a bit more about me for those of you who are new to the channel. I'm an author as well as a bookseller. This is my book 100 Must-Read Fantasy Novels, published in 2009. My best-selling book is 100 Must-Read Science Fiction Novels, published in 2006, 7 printings to date. And I also wrote this book, 100 Must-Read Books for Men. How terribly politically incorrect, back in 2008. But there you go, that's out of print now, I think. But who knows, my stuff comes and goes, it really does. So there you go. So speaking from a position of authority, professional bookseller and writer, man and boy, and huge reader for many years. So today I'm going to do my top 10 classic fantasy, open brackets, sword and sorcery, close brackets, novels and series. So yeah, so we're going to look mostly at stuff published before 1977, which is when the boom started, when Lester Del Rey commissioned Terry Brooks's Sword of Shannara, and publishers all realised that what people wanted was lots of Tolkien rip-offs, high fantasy and stuff. But of course, what we think of as fantasy, we think of sword and sorcery, we think of high fantasy, we think of fantasy in a very broad sense. It's a very broad term. It's as broad as realism. So what I really want to focus on when people say fantasy in a popular sense, what they really mean is high fantasy and sword and sorcery. So let's get high fantasy out of the way first of all. What do we mean by high fantasy? Well, what we mean by high fantasy is sagas which really end up in a world-changing thing at the end. They usually have a tripartite structure, which is the sort of characters are gathered, the second part is the quest and the conflict, and the third part is the climax, the final battle, what have you. And then the world is changed. So it's rather like the paradigm shift that you get at the beginning of SF, and when you get a second paradigm shift at the end in really good SF, what you call a conceptual breakthrough. And if you're uncertain about these terms, look at my videos in the Elements of SF series, because they are relevant to fantasy as well, and there'll be more coming up in that series soon. And really, that's sort of high fantasy, and that's sort of typically the Tolkien thing. And there's not going to be any mention of Tolkien in this apart from this, because what we're going to look at here is sword and sorcery. Now, the term sword and sorcery was coined by Fritz in about 1961, when Michael Moorcock said we really need a term for the stuff which come out of the pulp magazines, which come out of the influences of people like Dumas, Arthurian romance, the Nordic sagas, Beowulf. You'll see there's various editions of Beowulf there. There's my old Penguin Classics one, which you can't see. I'll show it to you. I've had that, you know, since the year dot, and by that I mean the 80s. There's a wonderful American prose translation. You can't get this in the UK, so if you want this, you've got to get it from Amazon.com, as it were, or an American internet bookseller, because this is not for sale in the UK for copyright and market reasons, which means that somebody holds the rights to it, but they're not publishing it, so it's actually illegal to sell it in the UK. So I had to get that from Amazon.com, and that's a great one if you want a prose translation. Really fantastic. And of course, there's Tolkien's version. And, you know, there's retellings, loads of retellings. This is an ancient puffin of Rosemary Sutcliffe's Dragon Slayer, the story of Beowulf. This is now just called Beowulf, and there's a nice puffin of it, and she's a great storyteller. And Beowulf, of course, you've got all the classic things which are in high fantasy, the symbols, the tropes, the dragon, the named sword, wizards, fiends. Grendel, of course, is the fiend in Beowulf. I always love that, the fiend Grendel. The first version I read was in some sort of big anthology, and Grendel was described as a fiend, which I always thought was fantastic. And of course there's the postmodern renderings. I know we're going off into Beowulf territory, but I'm having fun, so tough it out. So there you go. There's a postmodern rendering by John Gardner, sadly no longer with us. This is in Fantasy Masterworks, actually, in the UK, and Golax. This is a US edition. And in this, there's a wonderful part where it's just from Grendel's point of view, the fiend's point of view, and he has a conversation with an existentialist dragon, which is brilliant. So, you know, if you like your sophisticated literary stuff, you can't go wrong, really. So, yeah, so those are part of it. And, of course, as I say, you have, you know, the motherlode of historical fiction. Here's a cracker. If you like historical fiction and you like Vikings and Nordic stuff, this is The Long Ships by Bengston. Till recently, there was a format Collins Old Granada version still in print. This is New York Review of Books, and this is the sort of thing, if you like Viking sagas, if you like good historical fiction, this is authentic, and it's by somebody from Scandinavia, so you can't go wrong. Isn't that beautiful? So that sort of thing is thrown into the melange as well. And, you know, just to refer back to the Arthurian thing as well, you've got Sutcliffe again, typical. You know, the Arthurian rabbit hole is deep, and there's loads of it, and we'll go down that at one point. But yeah, so high fantasy, sword and sorcery has similar tropes, dragons, swords, wizards. It's less sort of big on the quest thing. It's more about the bad behaviour of these lovable rogues, of individual characters who are often doomed. They're anti-heroes. So, you know, heroic fantasy is often used as a term exchangeable with sword and sorcery. And if you look in the Encyclopedia of Fantasy, it says there's no real discernible difference between sword and sorcery and heroic fantasy. But what I like is anti-heroic fantasy. And the thing is, most of the great sword and sorcery heroes are anti-heroes. So yeah, 1961, Moorcock said, you know, what are we going to call this stuff? And Fritz Leiber, who'd been writing sword and sorcery since about 1940, he said, let's call it sword and sorcery. So I'm going to do my top 10. There's probably some other stuff in here. I've got an enormous amount of books here. And is this a ranked one? No, I'm going to try and go in publication order from oldest to newest and take it through. So if we go back to the pulp magazines in the early part of the 20th century, we have to acknowledge the influence of what some people now call Sword and Planet. It's not Sword and Planet, it's planetary romance. And if you look at Edgar Rice Burroughs, John Carter of Mars, and if you look at the sort of planetary romances of the 30s, where there's things like Lee Brackett's Sword of Rhiannon, and you get these things, you get sort of classic romantic planetary venues like Mars and Venus, and it's Mars with canals, and it's Venus with slinky maidens, and it's very hot and watery. Sort of like the fact that we know, we knew a long time ago that it wasn't actually like that, those romances. So there's elements of that in there, but we want to separate out from that. So if we look at the guy who really got that going, we could talk about high fantasy, we could talk about Edison, we could talk about James Branch Cabell, we could talk about Lord Dunsany, but that would lead us down the Tolkien end, and we're not going to go down that end. We're going to go down sword and sorcery, anti-heroes, hard and fast, blood and thunder, doom, dreamers in the dregs of destiny, and all that wonderful stuff. And people call it grimdark. Who needs a term like grimdark? You don't need it. The natural form of sword and sorcery is grimdark, but sometimes with flashes of humour. So we shall see. So I've got tons of books here in front of me, so let's begin without any further ado. Now, what I've got to do is I've got to take this wonderful copy of Poul Anderson's Broken Sword and just put it down there a moment, because I want to show you where it all starts. And it all really starts with Robert E. Howard. This is the complete chronicles of Conan, all the stories, the one novel, The Hour of the Dragon, also known as Conan the Conqueror. And this has also got the stuff which he left sizable fragments of, or wasn't published at the time, that was finished by other hands. But about 2/3 of the book is pure him. There's been lots of Conan books by other hands. Ignore those. Stick with the ones with Howard. So the best thing to do really is to get this one, because this is the authentic thing. This is gone. This is a first edition. This is probably worth about 100 quid now, maybe more. And it's still in print. And I got this when it came out, which must have been the centenary edition. Centenary of what? Centenary of Howard's birth, I think. So around about the turn of the 21st century. And they're all in there. And Conan, of course, a thief, a slayer, a reaver. His stories were written in the last couple of years of Howard's life before he committed suicide. And really, you know, there's a lot about Howard. I don't talk too much about his personal life and what have you. But before he created Conan, Howard was writing all sorts of things in all sorts of genres, sports stories, adventure stories, the lot. And, you know, before that, he created Kull, and this is King Kull in Sphere, this is an old sort of 70s one, and Cull precedes Conan. There was Bran Mac Morn. He had several characters because Conan has got long black hair, blue eyes. He's from Cimmeria, which they say is kind of based on Ireland, and the Hyborian Age is about 10,000 years ago. It's before the oceans drank Atlantis, and he was a man of gigantic mirth, you know, and he's a thief, a slayer, a reaver, and you know, it's just great stuff. And I think the first Conan story I read was the Frost Giant's Daughter, which is wonderful. And stories like Red Nails, People of the Black Circle, they have all the elements. The basic Conan story is that, you know, he's sort of tootling around, he's a mercenary, he'll do whatever he likes, he's a thief. And, you know, he hears in a tavern about some tower where there's a fabulous jewel, but unfortunately the tower belongs to a wizard, and he breaks in, sometimes with another character, and he's often hanging out with glamorous women like Belit, the pirate queen, things like that. And he breaks in and he confronts the horror of the monster and the wizard and what have you. And then he gets out the eggress, you know, and he wins, you know, it's that sort of stuff. You get that a lot. And in, you know, later on, he's king of a kingdom called Aquilona, which Aquilona is sort of based on medieval France. And there's another sort of interesting early sort of sword and sorcery thing which invokes that as well. And some of the earliest written stories, he was already king. He's a usurper. He's in his 40s. So they're written out of internal chronology. So in the volume I showed you, they are in the order of publication. And they were mostly in Weird Tales magazine. Weird Tales, of course, featured Lovecraft a lot. And it was the definitive pulp magazine that merged SF, fantasy and horror. The fantastic, the weird. Great stuff. So that's Conan. Not to talk any more about Conan, let's move on. Well, the thing is, he sort of did the template, and you had people like Lee Brackett, as I say, great female science fiction author, doing some planetary romance. She was influenced by a combination of Edgar Rice Burroughs' John Carter Mars novels and a bit of Howard's, a bit of swordplay. But my favourite writer from that period is the very wonderful C.L. Moore, Catherine Lucille Moore, who later married Henry Kuttner, and they wrote a lot together. And this is an old Gollancz Fantasy Masterworks edition of Black Gods and Scarlet Dreams. Now, these stories have been collected many times under different titles, what have you, and this is effectively two tranches of stories. Scarlet Dreams are the stories of Northwest Smith, who's this is the definitive sort of SF hero. He wears a blaster at his hip, he has a talon scar on his face, he wears a leather jacket, he's always in trouble, another girl, another planet, and he's kind of the model Han Solo really. But enough about Northwest, we're going to do him again. I'm a huge fan of those stories. But Black Gods are the stories about Jirel of Joiri, who was the first female sword and sorcery heroine, and they're wonderful stories. And Jirel lives in a kind of alternate medieval France, and C.L. Moore's stories are very decadent. They're very lush. The prose is beautiful and poetic, and they're very sensual. And basically, you can see the influence of the sort of symbolists and decadent sort of poets like Rimbaud and Verlaine and Baudelaire, the influence of Poe, because, you know, Poe was one of the motherlodes. He influenced all these people in sort of poetry and literature in France, particularly in the end of the 19th century. And also, you know, his influence spread into SF as well, because of course he invented the detective story. He did primal SF stories and amazing supernatural horror fantasy stories. So Moore definitely has that influence. And Jirel is a sword wielding heroine, and she's the first, you know, she's great. And the stories in this: Jirel meets magic, Black God's kiss, Black God's shadow. You get the word black coming up a lot, and they're just fantastic things. And she goes into underworlds, confronts strange beings. She has flings with sort of male sort of soldiers and what have you, and warriors, and you know, they're great stuff, you know. So you can get them. They're now in a Gollancz Golden Age masterwork called Jirel of Joiri, which looks like this. And that has all of them. So this edition's out of print. It's got lovely Gorgon's head on there, and that's because the first story in the Northwest Smith series, the Scarlet Dream series, is Shamblo, which is partially based on the old Gorgon myth. So there you go. So women got there early on, and C.L. Moore, she was a doyenne, the doyenne of Weird Tales magazine. So the great triumvirate there was Howard, Lovecraft and Moore. fantastic. Still not enough people have read her. I'd love to have met her. She's been gone a long time. What an absolute star she was. At the end of the 30s, the beginning of the 40s, more people started to write more pure sword and sorcery. The planetary romance thing was there, but there were people who realized that, you know, you had to do something different and cleave it away from SF and make it about magic, the supernatural, the irrational, the anachronistic. And, you know, sort of really, this is something I'm reading at the moment. I don't know whether I'd include these in my top 10. So this is like a bonus, as it were. And this is probably going to be 12 or something. Is I'm making my way through The Incomplete Enchanter by Lynn Sprague de Camp and Fletcher Pratt, and The Magical Misadventures of Harold Shea, and that's Odin on the cover there. And these are a series of novellas, and they come in 3 volumes. That's Castle of Iron. I have read some of these before in anthologies and what have you, but I've recently acquired this lovely set of Sphere 70s paperbacks, and that's The Enchanter Completed. And Harold Shea is this young chap. These are written sort of early 40s and up until the mid 50s, and there was one later one after that. And they're novellas, and basically they look at different fantasy worlds, and Shea manages to magic his way into them for a bit of adventure. And the very first adventure, he ends up in the Nordic cosmology, and it's called The Roaring Trumpet, and in that he meets Thor, Heimdall, Odin, and it's done very, very lightly, and the influence is obviously there, and it's drawing directly on those things. But he doesn't drop all the names, like when the Rainbow Bridge Bifrost appears. He doesn't tell you it's that. When Hugin and Munin, the ravens, appear, he doesn't tell you. Straight away, you only know if it's Odin if you know your Norse cosmology. And it's a great fun story, and they're great fun ones. And the second one is based on Spenser's Fairy Queen, and he later ends up in the Kalevala, the Finnish epic, and all sorts of other things. There's, what else does he do? He ends up in all these different sort of, there's one which is, I think this is the one which is Orlando Furioso, which is the Italian one. And, you know, they work their way through. And there's a wonderful introduction in here by Sprague de Camp, who's a great non-fiction writer as well. There's a great biography of Lovecraft about Fletcher Pratt, his collaborator, who died quite young. And there was certainly a Golax masterwork of these, which I think you can still get. So pick it up if you can. And they're just charming. They're very well written, and they're funny, and they really did know their stuff. You know, they understood the whole thing about these wonderful stories, which are the precursors of fantasy literature as we know it, when story was all one thing, when there was no realism, there was no SF, there was no fantasy, it was just story. So these are great to pick up. So these are, say, starting about 1940. They're well worth looking for. And Sprague de Camp later on finished some of the Conan stories, interestingly enough, and he was very, very good. And shame that Fletcher Pratt died so young. He was only about 58, I think. So there we go. Round about the same time, the chap who coined the term sword and sorcery, Fritz Leiber, who was a Shakespearean actor, he did have a problem with alcohol, apparently, so they say. He's in the 1943 colour Universal remake of Phantom of the Opera. Very tall, distinguished man. And he also a lot of SF. Now, the jury for me is out on his SF. I'm going to reappraise some because I reread one of his award-winning stories a while ago, a late one. I wasn't that impressed. His horror fiction's really good. Conjure Wife is fantastic, and you know, there's some great horror fiction. But for me, his major contribution was in Sword and Sorcery, and this is Swords and Deviltry, and this is a lovely old Grafton A format from back in the 80s, and there are 7 books altogether. Now, it's slightly misleading because the 7th one was very late, The Knight and Knave of Swords, and that was a proper novel. What comes before it, they're all magazine stories, they're fix-ups. Now, a fix-up is where you have stories in a magazine, and with Howard, the novel, Hour of the Dragon, the only Conan novel, was a serial in Weird Tales. It was over 4 issues, I think. So these are similar, and these are the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser series, and they begin in the late 40s, and the Nebula Award was awarded to Ilmet in Lankmar, so that's obviously in the 60s, and that's in here. And like all these things, the writers wrote them out of internal chronology. The ideas came to them, they had a deadline, they had to make some money, they wrote them quickly, and they shuffled them around later because they didn't start getting collected into books until the 50s. You know, they weren't SF and fantasy books then, in the way there is now. It was all magazines, and this is in the USA, of course. So these are wonderful, and Fafhrd is a tall, urban barbarian. He's a big built guy, you know, he's handy with the axe and the sword. He will cleave you in twain from shoulder to thigh as well as look at you. But you know, he's sort of based on Conan to a degree. He's sort of witty and funny, and he's got a little chum who's his sidekick, the Grey Mouser, who is a thief. And you know, they're rogues, they're lovable rogues. They go around, and it's set in a world called Nuon, which is partially an anagram of nowhere, utopia. So it's great stuff, and these are lovely stories. And there's the very first full story in this, the Snow Women, shows a battle of the sexes, and it shows like it's like Fafhrd's origin story and how he escapes from the frozen waste where he lives, where his people, the women, are in charge, you know, and there's a lot of comedy out of that, and it's great stuff. And it shows him getting into scrapes and getting away, and then he hooks up with the Grey Mouser, and they then do a little caper in Ilmet in Lankmar, which ends with tragic consequences for them. And these are just lovely. So here we go. You can get them in 2 omnibus volumes from Golanc's Masterworks. I prefer these lovely old A formats. I'm just going to flash them to you now. They've got all these lovely filigree cod Celtic designs. There you go. That's Swords Against Death, the second one. Swords in the Mist, which are book 3. Swords Against Wizardry, book 4. The Swords of Lankmar, book 5. And book 6, Swords and Ice Magic. Now, a few years ago, quite a while ago, I got rid of pretty much all my fantasy books. So I've had to replace a lot of them, which is really silly. I kept some, and I don't have a copy of Knight and Knave of Swords, and I haven't actually read it. So I've got to finish that at some point. That was a late one. So Leiber, the man who coined the term sword and sorcery, witty, elegant, fleet writing, great characterization, lots of action, no messing, pulp fiction, but of a very high quality. You know, they're not throwaway, these. They're very elegant and sophisticated and sharp as a rapier. So you can't really go wrong. So that's Leiber. So I guess he's sort of number 3 in my sort of top 10, as it were. And then moving on, who have we got next? Well, I guess, let's see, who have we got? We sort of skipped forward a bit then because the war got in the way, of course. And, you know, a lot of these guys, the early American SF and fantasy writers, they ended up fighting in the war. You know, they did their bit. You know, they came in and helped us out in Europe and what have you. And they had their own thing going on with the Japanese and stuff, which was pretty bad for everybody concerned. And then one of those soldiers, he started his career in writing in the late 40s. And he's somebody I've mentioned many times on this channel. He's somebody, again, who has very beautiful prose, Shakespearean, wonderful sort of crackling dialogue, and that's Jack Vance. And I'm going to focus on The Dying Earth, collected 1950, magazine fix-up. I did a video recently about Michael Shea, or Michael Shea, I should say, and his connections to Vance and Lovecraft. I'm not going to talk too much about these because there's a lot of Vance material, but The Dying Earth, wonderful book. If you haven't read it, they're now published by Spatterlight Press, which is the publisher who have got the Vance legacy sort of rights, what have you. And this is their recent hardcover edition in laminated boards of Marizan the Magician, or Marizian the Magician, I should say, which is the title apparently that Vance wanted. Now, he's only in the first chapter. So Dying Earth, there's an omnibus from Gollanc's, there's a tow omnibus in the USA, 4 volumes, great stuff. And is it a science fiction thing? Because this science fantasy is End of Time. Because I did think very hard about putting the Book of the New Sun into this by Gene Wolfe, but I'm pretty settled on the idea that the Book of the New Sun is SF, and we'll come to that again. So we'll talk about Gene Wolfe another time when I do a Gene Wolfe video. But these are fantastic. The Dying Earth narrative, where does it come from? Well, I think that it comes from the final chapter of The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, and the time traveller goes forward from the 802,000 or whatever it is when he meets the Moorcock, and he goes to the end of time, and the sun is gradually going out, there's strange creatures there, and it's a sort of nightmarish, doomy chapter. It's very scary, and it really makes you feel it. So the Dying Earth stories are set in that sort of milieu, but there are still people around, and they appear to be able to do magical things. Or is it just science? Who knows? But we'll go with magic. So definitive fantasy, the Dying Earth series began in 1950, went on episodically from then. Lovely, beautiful stuff. Vance had a very long career. You know, he delved into Arthurian stuff. This is one of his late Arthurian novels. Lioness 3, Madook. I'm after, this is Grafton, I'm after the first two in B format in mint condition, because I haven't read them and I didn't buy them at the time and I should have, and now they're like hen's teeth. You can get them, they're always in a state, and you know me, I generally don't buy books which are in a state, so we'll see. I got this from Derek Adaman in Hay about 4 or 5 years ago, and Derek and I gave me some money off because they know I'm a bookseller, so they usually do me a good deal, so I was really pleased with that. Fantastic stuff, very beautiful. So Vance, lots of great SF, but he did some fantasy as well for you to have a look at. So we're into the 50s, and you know, that was a real boom time for SF. There was some fantasy being written, but the whole thing, of course, you go to a bookshop now and the SF and the fantasy are together, which I don't think they should be. I'm going to talk about that a different time. They should be separated out because they're distinct things, but it takes a real expert to do that. And to really tell whether a book is fantasy or SF, you have to read it from beginning to end, because some things appear to be fantasy and they're SF, and some things appear to be SF and they're actually fantasy. If you take, for example, Anne McCaffrey's Dragon books, they look like they're fantasy novels, but they're not, they're SF. And you soon realise when you start to read them that they might have all the symbols and the tropes, the dragons, the swords, what have you, but they are SF novels. They're set on another planet in the distant future. They have genetic engineering in them, and they have something very, very clever related to a thing called the thread, which I won't tell you about. So even though they're sort of written like a Mills and Boon novel, they're like romantic novels, the sort of thing Marion Zimmer Bradley would do, they are very clever and they've got some good SF ideas in them. They just take a while to get there. So as I say, you know, the 50s, it was mostly SF, and you know, you couldn't go into a bookshop then and find a fantasy section. There was so little fantasy published, so little sword and sorcery. It was a real specialized thing. You know, Tolkien's work started appearing 53, 54, and Lord of the Rings, of course, what people don't realize is that he wrote it as one book. He wanted to publish it as one book, but the publishers, Unwin, thought they couldn't market it as one book. Also, the binding technology at the time would have meant it would have had to have Bible paper, it'd be really thin, so they decided to split it into 3, and that's where the idea of the fantasy trilogy comes from. And the fact is, there are no other significant fantasy trilogies until 1977, when Lester A does Terry Brooks, and then it all becomes a formula and everybody's ripping off the high fantasy. Tolkien was the outsider, that's the thing. He didn't get popular until the mid to late 60s when he got picked up by hippie students on the campuses in America. He was a cult author. You know, he had acclaim from the beginning, but he wasn't a massive bestseller. So the real sort of true original fantasy thing is sword and sorcery, not high fantasy. So yeah, you can look at Dunsany and Edison, but if you look at the stuff that comes roaring out the pulp magazines, which is full of energy and verve and fire, it's sword and sorcery, short and sweet, hard and fast, fleet. And there's Conan the Rebel by Poul Anderson, and that's the sort of thing. Look how small that is. And you know, short, sharp, economical fantasy books for me are the best. Who needs all this bloated stuff? It's the same old thing. Fantasy is supposed to be about imagination. If it's about imagination, why do we see the same old tropes? It's just comfort reading. It's escapism. Now, I read fantasy for escapism, and I don't read it that much, but I like to get into the sort of symbolism of those familiar tropes and what have you. So that's all very well and good, but I want it elegant, I want it literary, and I want it to have a certain amount of elan. So what was happening in the 50s beside Tolkien? Well, in the same year as The Lord of the Rings, my favourite fantasy novel of all time was published, and that's The Broken Sword by Poul Anderson. There is a video on the channel where I unbox another Poul Anderson, The Merman's Children, and I talk about The Broken Sword there. And I've got various editions. This is a Sphere edition. That one there's the current fantasy masterworks from Gollancz. There are 2 different texts, and look at that, isn't that fantastic? This is the first copy I bought way back in the early 80s. This is the Sphere one, which makes it look like a science fiction novel. And this is basically set in 8th century England. It's a very, very dark Nordic book. The basic idea is about one of these sort of older ideas in fantasy cosmology, which is about the idea of the changeling. There's a war between the elves and the trolls. And the elves in this, they're very dark, eldritch beings. They're not, you know, they're not as accessible as they are in Tolkien. You know, they don't really care about human beings. And there's this plotting going on in this war where a changeling is sired, because of course elves can't touch iron. So one of them sires a changeling child with a troll witch, and it can touch iron, and that's Skaflock. And he has a doppelganger, because Skaflock then is put into a baby's cradle, a human baby, and the human baby is taken away. And there's this doomy battle which eventually comes together of the two children who appear to be very similar, and one is half elf, half troll, and the other's human. And it's got all the classic doomy stuff. The weather is always terrible in it. It's always raining and stormy and tempestuous, and it's very bloody and violent, and the horses always run at 1,000,000 miles an hour. It always feels like the Wild Hunt, and it really is fantastic stuff. And it's got, you know, the Viking soul. For me, it's the finest fantasy novel ever. I've got another edition here of it somewhere. This is another Gollancz one from about 15-20 years ago. I say there's two different texts out there. He did talk about doing a sequel. I'm glad he never did, because it's in, it's out, it's over, it's done. And everything's sort of like very, very grim and very, very dark. So if you like your grim dark, this is where it comes from, the broken sword. And that very title alone summons up everything in the dark, shadowy Norse cosmology, the Northern European mysticism, where, you know, the world is doomed to end in ice and fire. And it's great stuff, it really is. So that's my favourite fantasy novel of all time. And that's 1953. So it's the dark alternative to Fellowship of the Rings, and I sell it a lot by talking like this about it. Then we get to the 60s, and there's by that point a pantheon of sword and sorcery writers. You know, there's Howard, who sadly is gone. There's C.L. Moore, so she was there. You had Fritz Leiber was producing these stories. They'd pop up every now and again. Jack Vance was doing his thing. People like Pratt and de Camp. There were other writers out there as well who were more minor. Poul Anderson was doing his thing. He did lots of SF, but he did quite a few fantasy things as well. There's 4 or 5 of them, and they are the best things he wrote, in my opinion. His SF isn't as good. It's interesting, but not as good. And the Conan sort of industry was sort of going. You had sort of young Turks coming into it. People like Andre Norton was doing great children's fantasies. And you had, you know, the odd traditional SF writer would write a fantasy story, because the magazine markets were still just about there. And this is one of my favourites. This is The Complete Traveller in Black by John Brunner. And what you notice there again, as with the Fletcher, Pratt and de Camp, is the archaic spelling of complete. And this is one of my favourite fantasy books. It's a singleton, it's a one-off. It's 5 stories which were in magazines. And look at that, beautiful. And I got rid of my copy, and I've been looking out for a decent one, and I bought this. This was described as good on Abe, and I thought, well, I've got to get one back in the library, and it's virtually mint. It's fantastic. And this is the copy, this is the edition I bought back in the 80s, early 80s, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories. And these started appearing in the 70s. I'm talking about the 60s. These appeared in the 70s, but they have a 60s feel, and I'm going to backtrack to the big 60s and 70s person. But I just wanted to talk about this at this stage, because I'm so pleased to have it again. And the Traveller in Black is, as you see, a man in black. He's like a wizard, and he travels cross-when, across different times and places. And it's about the balance between order and chaos. So they're very wise, they're very literary. The pace is sort of very stately, and they're like a cross between Jack Vance, Fritz Leiber, and the person I'm going to talk about next, who really blew things out of the water, and that's Michael Moorcock. But if you can get this, do get it. Great stuff. There is a 7-house hardcover. Well, there was a 7-house hardcover, but it only has 4 of the stories in. It's very, very uncommon. I would love one, but, you know, it's pricey and hard to find in good nick. So watch out for this. This is a neglected classic, The Complete Traveller in Black. Absolutely beautiful. It has the sort of prose feel of high fantasy, but with all the sort of great elements that you get in classic sword and sorcery. Very wise book, fantastic stuff. So Michael Moorcock. Well, in the 80s, my living seemed to be the guy who explained Michael Moorcock to fantasy fans, and I don't want to talk about him at enormous length here. I'm going to talk about him briefly. The fact is this, is that the most important sword and sorcery writer ever to come out of Britain, and you know, and in some ways the first one really, was Michael Moorcock. And Moorcock was born, when was Mike born? 1940, 1941, and he grew up in London in the bomb sites, and he was a professional writer and editor by the age of 15. He was an Edgar Rice Burroughs fan, and he was doing work for a magazine or comic called Tarzan Adventures. And he soon started writing. He wrote SF, all sorts of other things, used different pseudonyms. He was a real pro, a real Grub Street pro. And then he started writing in the 60s the Elric stories. This is the first Elric novel in its American Lancer edition. Look at that, isn't that gorgeous? The Dreaming City, which in the UK was published by Hutchinson as Elric of Melniboné. And this is where the story begins. Now, The Dreaming City, this edition, is an abridged edition. So you want the one called Elric of Melniboné, but you want that because the cover's so nice. Now, that was pretty much the last one he wrote of the original Elric sequence, because again, they were written for magazines. He just come up with a character, and Elric is not human. He's a Melnibonéan. Melniboné is an empire that rules the world for thousands of years, and then mankind starts to evolve. And the Melnibonéans are kind of elvish beings. They're white-skinned, they're tall, they're decadent. They're sort of, their civilization's on the wane, and they're more like sort of figures from late 19th century French symbolists writing, the sort of thing that J.K. Huysmans would do. And, you know, they're very cruel and inhuman. And Elric is an albino. Has problems with his blood, so he has to take certain herbs and drugs to stay alive. He has to perform magical rituals because the emperors of Melniboné, of which he is the last one, he's about the 600th or something, their empire's fading away. They have dragons which sleep underneath the city of Imrir, the capital on the island of Melniboné, and, you know, the Dreaming City it's called. And the dragons only come out now and again, and they use them to oppress their sort of enemies and things. But people are growing up. There's the young kingdoms. People are starting to sort of get their act together. They're trading with each other, and they're going to supplant the Melnibonéans. But they don't really care. You know, they're on the way out. And Elric has a cousin called Wycombe, who is foppish and decadent and ambitious, and he wants the ruby throne. He wants to sit on it, and he wants to claim their cousin Cimmerel, the female. So there's a kind of incestuous thing going on there, and that's echoed also in Moorcock's Jerry Cornelius sequence, and it's about the conflict between those two. It goes on beyond that, because the thing with Elric is both swordsman and sorcerer. And here's a copy of The Sleeping Sorceress. These days this is called The Vanishing Tower. This is a quartet one from the 70s. Again, they were fixed up into stories. The Elric bibliography didn't come together until the 80s, and I'm going to talk about that another stage, but suffice to say that there are reference sources. John Davey is the man to look at. Moorcock's Multiverse is the website. And there's a conflict between Elric and Wycombe, and Wycombe sort of, they both manage to claim these two swords, Stormbringer and Mournblade, which are effectively living things, and they hang in a place called the Pulsing Cavern, which can only be accessed through sorcery. And in their conflict, they both manage to get these swords, and the conflict goes forward. Elric ends up leaving Melniboné, and he traverses the world. He picks up a companion called Moonglum, who's a great character. He clashes with wizards in the same way that Conan did, but he's kind of the anti-Conan, you know, because he's more interested in morality and poetry than he is in cleaving and raiding. But Stormbringer, unfortunately, is kind of like a living spiritual entity, and it drinks the souls of men. It feeds on them. And the gods of Melniboné are the lords of chaos. And Moorcock's multiverse sequence, all his books are connected, basically is about the conflict between law and chaos. It's about the cosmic balance of when things tip too far, and the way the universe, the multiverses, all the universes, and the term multiverse comes from Peake and Mervyn Peake, and Moorcock took it up and run with it. And so it's kind of a quantum thing. So there's a big question around the Moorcock universe. Is it SF or fantasy? But that's for another time. So it's about the cosmic balance, and Elric serves the lords of chaos, notably Arioch, the Duke of Hell, the Knight of the Swords, and he sort of has fealty to him. So you will see him taking herbal drugs, chanting spells, summoning the Lords of Chaos, summoning all sorts of things in his fights against wizards and other swordsmen. He becomes a mercenary. So he does all this stuff. So it's amazingly faceted, and they're great stories, and they have wonderful titles like The Caravan of Forgotten Dreams, Kings in Darkness. You know, there's this great story about the Dead Gods book, The Jade Man's Eyes. They're fantastic. So at some point I'll do a tranche of Moorcock videos. I've done some about the collecting, the hardcover editions, what have you, but I will do some guides. And there's other guides out there, and the basic facts are sort of out there. So the secret with Moorcock is not to worry about beginnings and endings, just to pick an individual sequence, get the running order of that right, and go with that. What I would say is go with the 80s editions, if you can, of the Moorcock books. So read Elric of Melniboné, The Sailor on the Seas of Fate, The Weird of the White Wolf, The Vanishing Tower, The Bane of the Black Sword, and Stormbringer. Forget the others for now, because they're often very different and they were written much later. That's the run to go with. So Moorcock wrote a lot of those in the 60s and 70s. He also wrote the Coram Chronicles and the Hawkmoon ones. So there's a lot of stuff there. And, you know, they were sort of like his major money-making things. But the real reason he did them was so he could finance experimental SF writing in New Worlds magazine, the SF magazine he published. So people focus on them as his key things and his most loved things. But he wasn't really his agenda. His agenda was to use sword and sorcery to make money, to push forward the idea of new wave SF, of meshing literary modernism with genre tropes to take science fiction into its next phase. So that's why he did those books. But they're great, you know, they're fantastic, and they're really good fun, and they're short and they're sharp. You can't really go wrong with those classic Moorcock Sword and Sorcery series. In the 60s and 70s, at the same time that Moorcock was becoming one of the most important genre writers, most important writers of any kind in the world, with his sword and sorcery and his experimental new wave SF, there was another voice emerging, and a really important voice, the most important female writer of science fiction and fantasy who ever lived. You could say it was Mary Shelley. You know, she was an important progenitor, and there were others, of course, before that. C.L. Moore, Zena Henderson, Lee Brackett, Margaret Cavendish, way back with The Blazing World, which is about in the 1600s. You know, there were plenty of female writers doing stuff, but really SF and fantasy publishing was mostly male dominated. There were a handful of people. And this is for historical reasons, not for any sort of gender related reasons. It's just the way things were then. And then in the 60s emerged the very wonderful Ursula K. Le Guin. And this is a recent Gollancz edition of The Farther Shore, which is the second of an Earthsea trilogy. And I bought these. They were issued a while ago. There was a hardcover omnibus of the first three. There are 6 Earthsea books altogether. There's the initial trilogy, and these are written as children's books, and this is A Wizard of Earthsea. And A Wizard of Earthsea is set in an alternate secondary world, like the one behind me, and Earthsea is like an archipelago of islands, and they're very beautifully written. You can feel the fresh air, the breeze in your hair, the astringency of the prose. And it was there in her early sort of thematic trilogy of Hainish novels, the Worlds of Exile and Illusion. You can get that in Gollancz Masterworks. And there are Puffin and Penguin editions of these, with the 4th volume Tehanu, which was written later. These ones are from the 60s, early 70s, the initial trilogy. And of course, A Wizard of Earthsea is about a little boy from one of these islands who goes to a school for wizards. I wonder who used that idea by meshing it with a traditional school story in the 1990s. Well, there you go. So this is the real thing. In terms of the quality of the writing, these are probably the best written sword and sorcery series I've ever read. And I'm not much one for series. I prefer singletons, which is why I love The Broken Sword so much, and Poul's other fantasy works. But these are great. They are so wise. They have all the tropes in them. They look at race and gender. They were kind of ahead of their time. They weren't ahead of their time because SF was doing that as well. And the works of people like Delaney and Le Guin and her SF was doing that as well. Joanna Russ and some of the male writers were doing it too. And you just see the young boy, Jed Sparrowhawk, he's often called, and he learns magic through, it's all about words. Magic is in words, and it's in the use of words, and the use of spells. And he is tutored by a dark-skinned mage called Ogion, and unfortunately hubris grasps Jed, and he unleashes a shadow being which then haunts him and endangers the world. And that's the first one. And as I say, they're great. There's the second one. I was telling you the second one was The Farther Shore. It's not, it's the third one. The second one is The Tombs of Atuan. And this is a great adventure story where he goes in search of an imprisoned young lady, and there's some great sorceress daring doing that. I've not read this for years. I actually need to go back to them. They're just wonderful. I sell them all the time, and I need to revisit them because it's been way too long. And then you get the culmination of all this magical wisdom in The Farthest Shore. I prefer jacketed editions. There have been jacketed editions for years, not since the 70s. They cost the earth. There was a time when you could pick them up relatively cheaply, and I didn't do that. There's a wonderful Gollancz trilogy omnibus with a dragon on the cover from the late 70s. I've never managed to find one in good nick, or certainly not cheap enough, but these are wonderful. You know, if you only ever read one fantasy trilogy, read these. The later books, The Other Wind is good. There's Tales from Earthsea I was less keen on. Tehanu, which is the fourth one. So the sequence goes, let's get it right. We go Wizard of Earthsea, Tombs of Achuan, The Farthest Shore, that's the initial trilogy, and then you go forward into Tehanu, which is more of a YA book or an adult book. The Other Wind is much later. Tales from Earthsea is short stories. So that's the sequence, but I would stick with the first three. The others have their virtues, but for me, once Le Guin gets out of the 70s into the 80s, she gets a bit woo-woo and new age, and she doesn't work it as well for me then. I prefer the shorter, sharper books when she was more focused. And some people say that she found her feminist side more later on, but they certainly seem a lot more spider silk afterwards. They seem a lot more sort of gossamer thin, as if they're going to blow away in the wind, and they're less focused. So I stick to the early fantasy and the early SF. And of course the SF novels she wrote, The Left Hand, The Darkness and The Dispossessed, are just amazing. Everybody seems to think they're amazing. They just really are something special. So she was the girl. After C.L. Moore, Ursula Le Guin. So she's there in my top 10 sword and sorcery. What else do we have? Back in the 70s and 80s, when you went in a bookshop and said, you know, I've read Lord of the Rings, what else can I read? What other trilogies and what other series are out there? So alongside Moorcock, coming out of New Worlds magazine in the 60s and the 70s, was probably, this is my curveball really, because are these books fantasy or SF? Are they science fantasy? Do we want to go down that road? Well, we'll do it at some point. But really, this is the guy who takes it all apart. In the 70s, M. John Harrison took it upon himself to write the great anti-series of Sword and Sorcery, the Viraconium sequence, which you can get again in Gollancz Masterworks as a B format omnibus. But this is the Pastel City, the first of the sequence. As you see, very slim and economical, slender. And this is a sort of Unicorn Unwin edition, which Mike signed for me way back in '89 when he stayed at my place one night. What a time we had. Indian restaurant after doing the event and what have you. It was fantastic. And basically this is the whole thing where he takes it apart, and over the sequence of 4 books he looks at the sword and sorcery genre and deconstructs it. And the Pastel City is the most conventional one, and the central character, Tegeus Chromis, he's rather like Elric. He's very decadent, he's slim, he's lazy. He'd rather sit, you know, in his ivory tower and read and compose poetry, and he thinks he's better at poetry than he is at swordplay, and he's pretty good at that. And his kingdom gets invaded by these strange beings, and you know, you're about 2/3 of the way through the book. There's other characters. It's very arch. The prose is very beautiful and sort of pre-Raphaelite-esque, and at the same time is shot through with sort of iron musculature as well. It has that mechanical feel. Wonderful sort of Baroque thing. I can only sort of, if I sort of visual analogy would be to something like Barry Windsor Smith's Conan artwork, but sort of more Elric-esque and slim rather than mightily thewed. 2/3 of the way through the book, Chromis, you know, with an almost audible sigh of despair, decides to get up, don his cloak, get the sword into the scabbard, ride out and save the day. And it's absolutely wonderful. And I do love this book. It is quite something. I need to reread because it's been a long time and I've read these several times, and absolutely fantastic. And Viraconium, of course, is a Roman word. There's a Roman city, which I think Viraconium, I think, is somewhere in the Midlands. I'm saying not Coventry, but it's that sort of neck of the woods. And then a little while later, Mike Harrison decided to sort of take things even further with one of the most challenging books you'll ever read, and that is A Storm of Wings, the second Viraconium book. This is let's get the glare off it. This is a Doubleday US first edition. I only acquired that recently. Isn't that beautiful? And Storm of Wings, this is the 80s Unwin edition. As I say, these were published in the 70s. And there's another sort of strange thing happening in Viraconium. There's what they call the Year of the Locust, and these bizarre insect mechanisms are sort of, invading. And some of the feel of this is a bit like Dune in a way. Some of the language, the sort of names and the terminology made me think of Dune. But as you see, it's very sort of short and sharp again. And there's this new city being built outside Viraconium, but the beings building it are not men. And it's up to Tegeus Chromis and his sort of gang of cronies to get together. There's also bizarre characters in Viraconium, which is where the peak thing comes in. And they set out to sort of deal with this invasion of sort of weird locust beings. It's utterly bizarre. It's not an easy read, it has to be said. I think at that point M. John was honing his style, was bringing it together, and was trying to, do something with the language. And he's an experimental writer. He won the Goldsmiths Prize recently, which is a prize awarded to writers who are expanding the sort of possibilities of fiction. So he's about taking things apart. And he said that in his world, world building is not the thing. What he does is he takes the reader and drops them in terra incognita into an earth they don't recognize, into a world they don't recognize. And you've got to sort it out for yourself. So it is genuinely imaginative and fantastic. And he doesn't sort of info dump and fill in all the clues. You've got to work it out. And gradually what happens throughout the books is that you start to see that he's doing something very clever and metafictional. He's writing fiction about fiction. The third book in the sequence, which is Sherna Golank's first edition, world first, in Viraconium, 1982. I think it won the Guardian Fiction Prize, or it was at least shortlisted, with its sort of Beardsley-esque cover, which kind of tells you everything, is yet another more ornate but better written Viraconium novel. Mike at this point has sort of smoothed out his style, so he's doing all the weird stuff, but he's also sort of, writing very elegant, easy to read prose with wonderful similes and metaphors and colour in it. And absolutely beautiful. And this is, I say, is a first and is signed. And I'll just show that to you now. There we go. We have the usual glare problem, but there's the signature and the Beardsley cover, as I say, allying itself to what I was saying about the symbolists and decadence. And then that was succeeded in 85 by this book, the fourth and final book in the Viraconium sequence, which is Viraconium Nights, which is a collection of short stories. And some of these are just so bizarre. I mean, if you like people like China Miéville and you haven't read this, if you like Alistair Reynolds and his gothic mode, when he tries to do the sort of gothic thing, which I don't think he's very good at personally, this is the real thing. This is where it sort of comes from, because of course Mike wrote space operas as well. He wrote the Centauri device in the mid-70s, and this kind of influence of Barrington Bailey there as well. Cross influence, the two of them I think influenced each other. And Bailey of course worked in the sort of New World Circle as well. And what you get in this, there's a particularly wonderful story. All the stories are great in here, but there's one called Luck in the Head, which is fantastic, which begins with an epigraph from Roland Barthes, which isn't exactly Tolkien, and the Lamia and Lord Chromis, that's a great story. And you begin to get the idea that the real world is pushing its way into Viraconium, or maybe Viraconium is a shadow of the real world, or maybe it's just metaphors and similes to the real world, and he's just using different names. And it climaxes with a story called A Young Man's Journey to Viraconium, which is fantastic. And a few years later, he rewrote this story and called it A Young Man's Journey to London. And all that he does, the only real sort of textual difference that I've noticed, and I need to close reread them, and I've read them several times, he substitutes the word Viraconium for London and vice versa. So in the later version you have London, and it is about a young man approaching a city for the first time and getting used to the idea of the urban and the strange and being dropped into an environment he doesn't know and getting used to it. And that really is what Viraconium is about. It's about him dropping you into this strange world, and you just have to work it out for yourself in the same way that you have to work out life for yourself. So it's great stuff. So it deconstructs sword and sorcery really beautifully. Starts off traditionally to a degree with the pastel city, and then goes on to the high weirdness of Storm of Wings, but it's still noticeably sword and sorcery. And then it becomes more and more ornate and strange and metaphoric, and then you break through into the real world in A Young Man's Journey to Viraconium. Or do you? Maybe it's only in A Young Man's Journey to London, which is in another collection. So that's the beauty of it. For me, the major sword and sorcery writer from this school to emerge in the 80s was Michael Shea. I've done a video recently about his work. This is Nifft the Lean, the first of the Nifft trilogy, and these have massive debts to Leiber, Howard, Harrison, all the people I've mentioned. Absolutely fantastic, crackling stuff, very witty and great characters. And if you love Howard, if you love Leiber, you know, you love that roguish thing of Kugel in The Dying Earth, you will absolutely love this. I'm not going to talk about it too much because there is another video. Fantastic. I need to reread it because it's been many, many years, but I love this. And the Nifft stories. I mean, this won the World Fantasy Award for Best Novel, and it's absolutely great. And that's in the days when the World Fantasy Award was picking really unusual things like Perfume by Patrick Suskind and things like Replay by Ken Grimwood, which basically, you know, influence Groundhog Day, and all these sort of repetitive living fantasies all pretty much come from Replay. It's very colourful and carnivalesque, and the characters are all wearing motley in a metaphoric sense, not literally, and it's got flashes of horror in it, which are just fantastically done. Descents into Hell, wonderful stuff. For me, the sword and sorcery writer of the 80s, Michael Shea. And I'm going to end with an obvious one, but still a great novel. The trouble now is it's overexposed, A Game of Thrones, the first volume of A Song of Ice and Fire. Now, I used to have the UK first edition, which is the world first with a Jim Burns jacket, not the book club edition, the real thing, but I sold it. It was my biggest score ever. I'm not going to tell you how much I sold it for. I sold it for a lot of money, and it was signed by GRRM. And when I met him, he said, "Oh, you've got the rare one." And I needed the money. It had to be done. I wish I'd kept it. Beautiful book. And sadly, they only got Burns to do the first 3 covers, so I had to get a reissue for the library. And, you know, the first 3 volumes of this series, Game of Thrones, Clash of Kings, Storm of Swords, which of course comes in 2 volumes, you know, they're great. You know, they're big and thick and what have you, so they have that Tolkien as meat, but they're more like Machiavelli than Tolkien. They're backstabbing, you know, and they're twisty and they're political. The intrigue is there, and they really sort of brought the hard and fast school back, except it wasn't hard and fast, it was hard and bloated. But there you go. But I think this is pretty much near perfect. I mean, he's a great storyteller. As a prose stylist, he's not bad. The characters are fantastic. You really get into it. We've all seen the TV series. We all know the book. But I think the last 3 chapters, it's like being in the ring with, you know, somebody like Muhammad Ali. You know, you've taken a boxing, you got a chance to fight one of the greats, and foolishly you decide to do it, you know, and you get the left cross, the right hook, and the KO. And if I'd written this, oh, I wish I had, then I'd have left it there at the end. You only really need the 1 volume. You don't need the sequels. Once the dragon wakes, then really it's kind of game over, except we know it isn't. But of course it grew in the telling, and, you know, it's still not finished. You know, the series, maybe the ending let us down. But, you know, I think this is a fantastic novel. And Tyrion Lannister, brilliant. Great characters. Martin is just so good with characters, and you sort of come to sympathise even for people that you initially dislike, like Jaime and what have you. Game of Thrones. So for me, that was like the last hurrah of the Golden Horde, really. And a nod to Roger Zelazny. When I met him, I said, you know, come on, there's a certain amount of amber in there. And he said, well, you know, Roger was a friend of mine. So you can understand that. So if you haven't read 9 Princes in Amber by Roger Zelazny and you like Game of Thrones, you really should. So that's sort of my top 10 or 10 and a half maybe sword and sorcery novels. Hope you've enjoyed that. As usual, it's a rambling off the cuff thing. I've decided not to give you too much about plots and characters because you want to read them for yourself. But if you want to read really good sword and sorcery, which is beautifully written, which avoids all the cliches and yet fulfills all the symbology of the archetypes, then you can go no wrong with these. So very traditional choices, I know this time. I don't really read fantasy anymore. I don't read Sword and Sorcery. I think it's all been done. I think the last trilogy I got through with Joe Abercrombie's initial First Law trilogy, because I liked the titles, the blade itself, Before They Are Hanged, and The Last Argument of Kings. Fantastic titles, and you can tell the writing's really good, and they're very funny, you know, and stuff. But like all these things, they go on and on and on, and diminishing returns, and they get worse and worse. So who needs that when you can have the bucket of water in the face that good SF brings you? But when you need Sword and Sorcery, cleave to these and give them a try. This is Outlaw Bookseller. I'm going to sign out now. Please like, subscribe, comment. I'd love to hear what you think. I'd love to hear from younger readers and female readers, as well as the traditional crusty old blokes who watch this channel. I know you're not old. Some of you are beautiful and young. Some of you were like me, beautiful and old. But, you know, if you can hit the like, that does make a big difference to the algorithm, because if I'm going to keep delivering this sort of expert insider knowledge, I've got to find a way to support this channel, because it's absolutely exhausting. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to go back to my holiday now and try to have some downtime, and bye for now.